Chapter 2. Santoris. As arranged marriages went, Callista had little to complain about. She had always known the choice of her husband would not be her own, as the old king's daughter and niece to the new king, Viego. Hers was always going to be a marriage of political gain. She had never felt any bitterness about it. It was just the way of things. She had long resigned herself to being married off to some fat old nobleman. So when Viego had informed her that he wished her wed to Hecarim, she was pleasantly surprised. She was under no misunderstanding, of course. Hers was a betrothal orchestrated purely to consolidate power. But as she sat beside Hecarim at the triumphal feast in the central square of the conquered city of Santoros, she felt the ancestors had not been unkind. Hecarim was only a few years her senior, and his rise within the Iron Order had been swift. He was its youngest ever Grand Master, and had already earned a swath of victories and honors. The Iron Order was the most powerful knightly order in the realm, in terms of both political weight and military strength, and that's not even accounting for its wealth. Hundreds of years of conquests had ensured that the coffers of the Iron Order's impenetrable fortress were overflowing with gold, precious jewels, and magical artifacts. It was several hours after nightfall. The tables were laden with food, and the ale and wine were already flowing freely. It was clear that the feast was already being prepared, even as the two armies had clashed on the plain before the city. Doubtless this was meant to be a victory banquet for the Santorisian king. Callista noted the fear among the servants, though they tried to hide it. Their masters had been slaughtered by those they now served. "Thank you," she said to a young servant as a plate of food was placed before her, but he looked startled to have been addressed and practically fled. Already it was a raucous affair. The Camavoran revelers shouted across the table, laughing loudly as they toasted the victory. Musicians played and a troupe of feline Vestian dancers performed, trailing magical swirls of iridescent light as they spun, somersaulted, and backflipped with inhuman grace. Viego and his young queen had not yet joined the feast, but had sent word for it to begin without them, and the nobles were embracing that command with vigor. Callista felt it was obscene to drink and dine while the city's inhabitants cowered in their homes, fearing for their lives, and she made only a pretense at eating. She would stay as long as etiquette demanded, but not a moment longer. Of course, things would have been much, much worse for the city had Viego not ordered restraint, but that would be little comfort to many people who had lost their loved ones this day. She was still bedecked in her armor, though it had been cleaned. She had not had time to bathe, but her hands and face were washed, and servants had combed and oiled her long ebony hair. She wore it unbound and free-flowing, as she would until the day of her marriage, whereafter it would be bound into braids, symbolizing the tying of her life to Hecarim's. Her spear leaned against the table at her side, never far from reach. There were close to 100 present, all of noble birth. Most were knights, though a few were aristocrats serving as her officers in the host. Those had been shunted to the tables on the edges of the gathering, of course. There was little honor to be had serving in the host, and even less gold. It was within the knightly orders where real wealth and prestige were made. Callista was well aware of the privilege afforded her through being part of her royal bloodline, but she liked to think she would have served in the host regardless. She would certainly have rather been feasting with her soldiers outside the walls than sitting among the warrior elite in Camavor, but this was where Viego wanted her, and so this is where she was. Hecarim sat at her left. He was an attentive and charming suitor, and his conversation was easy and light. Immediately around them were the other leaders of the knightly orders, who had accompanied Viego and the host to Santoris. Lord Ordono of the Knights of the Azure Flame, tall and severe, and the statuesque Lady Aurora, Grand Master of the Horns of Ebon. The latter was a loud and forthright woman with a fearsome reputation. Callista had instantly warmed to her. Across the table sat the Grand Master of the Golden Shield, one of the lesser knightly orders. He was of middling years and heavy set, with small piggish eyes and an ugly scar across his pale face. He was also well into his cups. It seems you have achieved the unachievable, Lady Callista, he drawled. Callista sighed inwardly, having no desire to engage him in small talk, but graced him with a smile that did not reach her eyes. How so, Grandmaster Sedona? You have forged the low-born rabble into a passably decent army, he said. He raised his goblet unsteadily, spilling some of its contents. I'll drink for that, for I never thought such a thing possible, nor that anyone would bother, particularly one of the royal bloodline. It pleases me to defy expectations. Most at court were aghast that she led the host. She didn't feel it arrogant to acknowledge her gift for military strategy, and stepping into the role of general of Camavor's immense standing army was, she believed, the best way she could serve her nation. Aristocrats saw little honor in leading low-born soldiers, but what did she care about what the feckless nobility thought of her? But why the host? Continued Sedona. Any noble order would be honored to have you ride with them. Why lead that rabble? That rabble won the day today, Callista noted. Besides, I am where I can serve Camavor best. All of Camavor. Too often in the past have the host been used to simply soak up arrows and blunt the enemy's charge. They are low-born, said Sedona, wiping his mouth. They are Camavoran and deserve more than to be treated as expendable. It is my belief that the host can be far more than that, and a strong host can ensure that we have a strong Camavor. Grandmaster Sedona grunted as his goblet was refilled. The knightly orders ensure a strong Camavor, he said. That's where the true power lies, as it always has. Callista barely concealed her dislike for Sedona. The knightly orders are not Camavor, she stated. There have been times where various orders have reneged on their promises or refused to pledge themselves to a newly crowned monarch. I believe the Knights of the Golden Shield fought against the crown during the reign of my ancestor King Cirero. Did they not? She's got you there, Lady Aurora said, grinning. Sedona glowered. That was 300 years ago, he snarled. My order has bled for the Argent Throne more than most. We swore ourselves to the new king on the day of his coronation. More than I can say for other orders. He glanced pointedly at Hecarim. The Iron Order had not pledged itself to Viego right away. That was not unusual, but it was also not a sign of confidence in the new king, particularly since the Iron Order had always been the throne's most stalwart defender. It had taken them a full week, and the promise of Callista's betrothal to Hecarim before the Iron Order offered its oath. Next strained as the nobles seated nearby waited to see if Hecarim would raise to the bait, but he merely laughed under his breath, dabbing at his mouth with a silk napkin. Callista raised a hand placatingly. Goading Sedona further would serve no one, even if it was amusing. No one is besmirching your honor of the Golden Shield, she said. My point is merely that it is wise for Camavor to have a strong, loyal military force of its own, independent of and in addition to the honorable knightly orders. Long may they serve. Sedona grunted at Hecarim. And you agree with this? Hecarim shrugged. If a strong host means less of my own will die, then why would I be opposed? Sedona waved his hand dismissively. If you weren't marrying her, you'd say otherwise. And the king's order to not sack the city? Bah! Makes the war hardly worth the effort. Hecarim's smile became cold, though his tone remained light. Drink some water, Grandmaster Sedona, he said in a loud voice. Else you'll be waking tomorrow with a sore head and a handful of honor duels from everyone you've offended tonight. There was soft laughter from those within earshot. They had gathered something of an audience, as the nobility were always hungry for court drama. Two grandmasters flexing their muscles was a delicacy few of them could resist. Sedona snorted and took another drink, ignoring Hecarim's suggestions of switching to water. Callista appreciated how Hecarim had deftly turned the attention from her. He gave her a wink only she saw. He's far better at these games of politics than I. Clearly, it was more than just his strength of arm that had seen him rise to lead his order so quickly, when the previous Grand Master had fallen in battle. Tying the Iron Order to the throne through marriage was a smart move. She had suspected initially that the idea had come from the king's shrewd chief advisor, but now she wondered if it had been put forward by Viego himself. He was certainly bold enough to have approached the king directly with the proposition, and if it was him who had proposed the marriage, she wasn't sure that she would be impressed with the scale of his ambitions, or wary of it. Something of both, she decided. Before she had a chance to puzzle on the notion further, a crier raised his voice above the din of the feast. "King Viego of Camavor and Queen Isilde, long may they reign!" As one, the gathered nobles rose to greet them. Flanked by the royal guard, and with the ever-present figure of the king's bodyguard, Vask, close behind, Viego and Isilde swept into the courtyard amid a fanfare of trumpets. The young king strode forward eagerly, a broad, winning smile on his face, while his wife seemed to glide along elegantly on his arm. They were utterly besotted with each other, and Callista couldn't be anything but happy for them. Viego had not known a lot of love in his life. As a child, he was given everything he demanded, except for the love of his parents. His mother had died in childbirth, and his father, already an old man when Viego was born, had completely ignored him until his elder heir was dead, and even then his attention was cold, stifling, and overbearing. The old king had died only months later, so Viego was given little preparation for ruling. Callista loved Viego as a brother and was fiercely protective of him, but even she acknowledged he had been a spoiled boy, and had grown into an entitled young man, unused to being denied much. Nevertheless, she knew him better than anyone. He had a good heart and felt things deeply, for better and worse. With the right guidance, she believed he could become a good king once he matured a little. At first, Callista was as shocked by Viego's impulsive marriage as any of the nobles, and more than a little concerned. Isilde was far from from a long and proud lineage, and the union didn't bring Camavor political power or wealth. She was not even Camavoran, but merely a low-born seamstress from a conquered nation. Yet Callista had quickly adjusted her assessment after seeing them together. Viego doted on Isilde like he had doted on nothing and no one in his entire life. For the first time, he put someone else above his own wants and needs. He listened to her, valuing her opinions far more than those of his advisors, or even Callista. And while the new queen was not formally schooled, she was fiercely intelligent and had an instinctive understanding of people and court politics. More importantly, perhaps, she was kind and considerate, and she tempered Viego's more impulsive and ego-led decisions. Callista finally had an ally, someone who could help rein in Viego and help ensure stability for Camavor. Now he was finally growing into his role as Camavor's monarch, and tonight's performance, for it was a performance, one that was masterfully constructed, showed a glimpse of the powerful and beloved ruler he could become. He oozed charisma and confidence, and he had timed their appearance perfectly. The crowd was already well oiled on both wine and victory, but other than the red-faced Sedona, none were yet so drunk as to be sloppy or belligerent. Viego was dressed regally, but not overly ostentatiously. That might suit the court back in Alavedra, but not here, in the aftermath of battle. He wore his gleaming black cuirass over his chest to assure that he was a warrior, even if he hadn't taken part in the battle. The jagged crown of king sat upon his brow, but his sword, the immense blade that was the true symbol of kingship, sanctity, was conspicuous in its absence. For her part, Viego's queen, Isilde, was a vision of demure beauty. Her face was a perfect oval, her blue eyes large and soulful. Her dress, which she made herself, was formed of innumerable layers of silk and velvet. It flowed around her like petals of a blossom. Rather than trying to conceal her foreignness in traditional Camavoran garb, Isilde had taken the bold stance of crafting a dress that enhanced it. The effect was magnified by the queen's artful choice of jewelry, a web of delicate silver chains bedecked with sapphires, unlike anything worn by the ladies of the court, though Callista suspected many would soon be mimicking the style. Isilde looked every inch the captivating foreign queen. Among the mass of rowdy knights and nobles, clad in plate and chain, she seemed as delicate as a flower, as precious as a jewel. Yet even so, Callista could see the contempt and disapproval behind the smiles of many of those around her. They hated that Isilde was lowborn. They hated that she was foreign. Oblivious, Viego and Isilde made their way to the table set aside for them, at the head of the courtyard. Viego helped his queen into her chair, giving her a kiss upon her hand, then turning to the gathering. "Brothers and sisters of Camavor," he declared, his voice as smooth as velvet and loud enough to be heard by every ear. "Today you make your kingdom proud. You make the revered ancestors proud. And you make me proud." A goblet was in Viego's hand, and he hefted it high. "Tonight I drink for you." A wholehearted cheer rose from the gathering, and hundreds of goblets lifted into the air, sloshing wine. Viego drained his own cup and hurled it aside, to the delight of the crowd. "Bring me another!" he roared, laughing. Viego began to sit, but Isilde leaned over and said something to him, placing a hand on his chest. "Ah, yes, thank you, my love. I almost forgot," he said, though Callista knew he had done no such thing. "The entire reason that we came here to Santoris." He clapped his hands, and an awed hush descended on the courtyard as a coterie of priests came forward, their heads low, their faces hidden behind their blank porcelain masks. Behind them, 4 bondsmen bore a golden box upon their shoulders, straining beneath its weight. They lowered it to the stone ground and dragged free the poles used to bear it, before bowing and slipping away. Viego stepped forward, smiling, and ran his slender hands over the intricate surface. He paused theatrically before releasing the catches with a solid pair of clicks, and slowly opened the box. The entire gathering leaned forward, straining to see. Callista silently applauded. He knew how to manipulate a crowd, and she didn't think that a bad thing. Not in the slightest. It was a necessary trait in a successful monarch. Viego's eyes widened as he drew the moment out, and he whistled through his teeth. "For this, we're going to need some light," he announced, his smooth voice low. But everyone heard him clearly. They hung on his words. Queen Isilde produced a glass sphere, small enough to fit comfortably in the palm of a hand. Viego took it from her with a flourish and held it to his lips. He breathed a word upon it, then tossed it lightly into the air. It hovered some 10 arm spans above him and began to glow from within, casting its pale light down upon the king and the golden box. Viego squinted up at it, frowning. "Well, that is clearly not bright enough." He scanned the faces in the crowd. "Where's my most trusted advisor? Nunyo Netcrit. Come forward, please. If you're not already too deep in your cups. Your king has need of your talents." Laughter followed the advisor as he picked his way through the crowd. His face was heavily lined like well-worn leather, and his eyes were sunk deep in shadowy sockets. Old he might be, but a fierce intelligence still burned brightly within him. He was unsmiling and severe as the best of times, but his perennial frown was even deeper as he made his way toward his king. It was obvious he did not approve of his singular talent being used as a parlor trick to entertain drunken nobles, but he shuffled dutifully forward regardless. Viego leaned down and spoke in the advisor's ear. Nunyo scowled and said something sharp in reply. Then he turned his gaze up toward the glowing sphere. His mouth moved in a whisper, forming silent, unknowable words, and a fey light appeared in his eyes. He extended one hand, and the sphere sent hurtling high into the night sky, like a shooting star, reversing its course and returning to the heavens. As it did, the light it emitted intensified, such that everyone in the courtyard was forced to turn away for fear of their eyes burning out. Within a matter of heartbeats, it was as if a new sun had been born, burning coldly above Santoris, casting everything for leagues around in brilliant, pale light. "Bravo! Bravo!" cried Viego as his queen clapped her hands in delight. "My thanks, revered Nuno. That is much better indeed." Still scowling, the old advisor slunk away. "Today, my friends, we make the founders of our great nation proud," Viego continued. He paced before the nobles, his eyes burning with passion and belief. "Our founding ancestors, the twins Camor and the noble Avora, smile upon us. They smile upon all of Camavor." He was standing once more before the golden chest. "And now, without further ado," he said, reaching in within, "I give you, my friends, Mikkel's chalice." With that, he lifted the revered artifact high. The chalice was lidded, inscribed with runes and ancient symbols. The air around it seemed to shimmer faintly, as if surrounded by a haze of heat. Murmurs of appreciation and awe erupted from the gathered knights. "Our noble quest to liberate this sacred artifact has been completed. When revered Camor lay dying, pierced through the heart by the black arrow of Astor, his sister Avora saved him. We all know this story, but what I did not know until recently was that she saved him using this. She held this chalice to his lips, and his wounds were healed. And now, after many centuries, it is returned to us." This was met with yet more cheers, louder than before. Glancing around at the sea of faces, Callista was disturbed to see a rapturous hunger in the eyes of the gathered aristocrats. How long has our noble quest and culture been corrupted? How long did it take for our quests to become little more than convenient and transparent excuses to plunder and raid, to kill, claim fertile lands, and steal from our neighbors? How long before they were used to justify invading any city-state and nation that would add wealth and esteem to the kingdom of Camavor? At her most generous, Callista guessed it had taken a handful of generations for Camor's questing ideal to be tainted irrevocably. At her most cynical, she wondered if it had started with Camor himself. He was a warlord, after all, and with sanctity in hand, he had built their beloved nation upon the corpses of defeated enemies. Today's battle had been no different. Santoris had long been an independent city-state to the southeast of Alavedra, just outside Camavor's ever-expanding borders. They had fought together as allies on numerous occasions through their shared history, and trade between the two had benefited them both. Yet all it had taken to sever those ties was for one priest to declare it was the will of the ancestors to reclaim, protect, in their words, some ancient heirloom of arcane power that resided within Santoris' walls. Any satisfaction she had felt from the day's victories was soured, and she did not join the greed-fueled cheering. This has to end. That would be no easy task, of course, yet for all his juvenile failings, she knew Viego to be a good man at heart. She had faith that he would do the right thing, with the right guidance. While everyone else cheered, Callista watched Isilde. The queen was smiling and laughing, but Callista could see that it was forced. Quietly, she thanked the ancestors. With Isilde's influence, change might actually be possible. While she was now queen of Camavor, the kingdom had crushed Isilde's own nation before she was born. That invasion had been declared a holy quest by the priesthood, just as this one had. If it were Callista alone seeking to guide Camavor past its questing culture, she did not think she would have much success. Both with Isilde's help, she was confident Viego would be swayed. Nevertheless, Callista was also deeply pragmatic. She knew today had nothing to do with claiming Mikkel's chalice. Who beyond the priest who had ever even heard of the artifact before this invasion was announced? It had little to do with the claiming of Santoris, either, though its wealth was welcome. addition to Camavore's coffers. Even in peaceful trade, alliances would be more lucrative in the long run. No, today had been giving Viego a victory in the field. He needed to send a message to those beyond their borders. It announced that while the lion, the fabled battle king of Camavor, was indeed dead, his son carried his bloodline. It declared Viego as someone not to be treated lightly. A timely reminder that Camavor was still a force to be reckoned with, and that to deny it would lead to slaughter. And besides, the knightly orders had been getting unruly. Giving them this victory would keep them content, at least for a time. Callista forced herself to smile and clap her hands. Today had been necessary. And yet, as she looked around her, the knights and nobles hardly looked like people at all. The unnatural glare from above leached their faces of color, making everyone appear as vile specters and ghouls. A cold shiver of dread ran through her.